Hello, hi. This is Anthony Padone for a series called SQL Server in 10 Minutes, or SQL ITM. Today we're going to talk about resource management. Let me just set my timer. Boom, 10 minutes. Okay. The management of resources according to the systems that you build. Very, very important. Let's get started right away. See if I have a screen here. We'll bring up the first screen. And as I always say, a picture is worth 1,000 words and a diagram is worth 1,000,000. So your job is to download these screens, download the diagrams, and study them. I'll discuss them quickly, but do study the diagrams when you download them. That's where the learning will take place. So resource management, screen one. We're going to talk about the Azure SQL, and we're going to talk about the logical server breakdown. Forget about the server instance for now. The logical server, and it has to do with Azure database, and the Azure databases can be expressed as single databases or elastic pools, and we'll discuss those guys. When you design a system within a single database or elastic pool, you have to assign resources, and the resources have certain limits associated with them according to compute generations that are predetermined. So, for instance, a Gen 5, Gen 4, those are compute generations that equally as well belong to a service tier that have limits assigned to them, and you build your system within those limits. When those limits are near reaching capacity or reaching their limits, governance kicks in. Things happen. Things start to slow down. Things don't process the way you want them to process. So when you build your systems, you have to understand the limits of what you're selecting. Is it appropriate to your workload? So real quickly, a resource has to do with limits and has to do with governance, the controlling of those limits. And they must be monitored. They must be reported on. So you have to get back information, metrics, and so forth, and then make adjustments. Below, we'll have some attributes and values determined by the compute generation, as I mentioned, Gen 4, Gen 5, and some others, and the service tier that also accompanies the assignment of the compute generation. So some of the dimensions of the metrics, or actually the resources, are requests, logical server limits, such as DBs per logical server. So there are a certain number of DBs that can be assigned to a logical server. So do know that when you're creating your systems. Also, a higher branch up is logical servers per subscription. So there are certain limits to how many logical servers you can have per subscription/region. There are counts of elastic pool counts and vCore counts or CPUs. There are counts on sessions and workers. Workers, which are threads that execute your query requests, so there are limits on those. If things aren't processing or being queued up, maybe you reach your worker limits. How would you know that? Because you're monitoring, you're getting reports, and you're keeping abreast of how the limits are being near thresholds. There are two major workloads in process during a managed instance, right? Or a managed process, rather. There's a user workload, which is your workload. You created it, you run your applications. But also there are internal processes, which are the workload of the system itself, which is handling availability, disaster recovery, backup restore, monitoring, query restore, automatic tuning. They're using resources too, and they're being controlled by governance also. So we have to adjust all those things according to your workload. There's dimensions on compute CPU. There's resources on memory, storage type, data, IOPS, translog rate, throughput. This is how you're doing a lot of index rebuilds and things are slowing down. Well, because you're passing the throughput on the transaction log. Don't panic. Don't throw everything out and restart again. Understand what's happening. So that's the screen one, and we'll get to the next screen in a second. So here's screen number 2, which goes into more detail about it. I have to really increase this one so we can see it. This is an extension of screen 1. So as you can see, resource management 2, talking about resource limits, the limits of the resources that are contained within the compute generation / service tiers. The resource governance, when those resources reach a limit, what kind of governance kicks in? What kind of queuing happens? What kind of expansion, if anything, happens? Or what should you do to change that? Do you have to go to a different generation? Do you have to go to a different service tier? Hopefully not, but maybe you do. But make those decisions beforehand so you can make better judgments. Talking about Azure SQL, Azure databases, not the managed instance in this case. So there's certain pricing tiers within the vCore model, and the certain names that are assigned to the vCore: compute generations, service objective, and compute size. A little confusing, but just some of the names that are thrown around talking about the vCore model. So don't get confused by that. Our discussion is limited to the vCore contained by the single databases and elastic pools. So the resource limits per single database and elastic pools. Very quickly, here's the listing of all the attributes of the domain of the elastic pools and the single databases, and it goes on forever, right? So all these various metrics, or all these attributes have values, and the values are determined by the compute generation that you chose and the assigned service tier to that generation. But there's a lot of, as you can see, that there's a lot of variables here and a lot of things that you have to be aware of. And we talked before about the workers, concurrent workers, sessions, concurrent sessions, the max. We didn't talk about, but also elastic pools. There's min and max elastic pools, the maximum number of databases, the max concurrent workers, the max concurrent logins, all right? Max concurrent sessions, data, IOPS, throughput. These things you have to be concerned about and understand before you design a system, please. Yes, these are managed processes, but it doesn't mean that you throw out everything and go about your business. It just means that things are handled for you, and it's your job to understand how they're being handled and how they're reaching their limits. And when they're reaching the limits, performance will suffer. So you have to be concerned about that. Here's a real quick study. So some of these attributes are then thrown through the template here, which then computes out to a service tier, which is general purpose, business critical, and hyperscale. And within those guys, you have the compute generation, the Gen 5, Gen 4, Gen 5, FSV2, Gen 4 for the critical, Gen 5 for the critical, and it's two different levels, 1, 2, 1, 2, different levels, 1, 2, 3 different levels for Gen 5 is 1, 2, 3 for the serverless. So each of those generations have different gradations of the limits and different counts or different sets or subsets of the variable metrics, okay, that are assigned to them guys. So here's a real quick example. I just chose the service tier of the compute tier for the Gen 4 compute generation, which is assigned to the service tier of the general purpose. And this guy, the compute tier, is provisioned, okay, because it can be provisioned or serverless. So if we look at this right here, the vCores, if I pick vCore 1, then I have all these other metrics assigned to the values. So the memory can be up to 7 gigs. The max data size is 1024, and so forth, and all these other attributes here. So your assignment within the generations and the number of vCores you picked also determine the other values and the other attributes that are within that generation. So these are all the attributes that are within the metrics of the elastic pool and the database, single database. And here's a quick example, and all other attributes here also are assigned. So it's a complex thing, as you can see. So if you're using this, understand the generation, the computer generations you're using, review the limits, make sure the limits are in line with your workloads, and make sure that you're monitoring this, make sure that you're getting the metrics that you need, and make sure you're making the correct adjustments and corrections when something does go wrong. You're not going to throw out the water with the baby, right? The baby with the water. You make the right corrections and move on. So planning is very important. Monitoring is very important. Adjustments are very important. That's it for that. But do download these screens for resource management. It'll get you started, and you'll understand how to design your system better. Signing out. Thanks for listening.